Hello, family. Numbers chapter 33. These were the stages of the Israelites' journey when they went out of the land of Egypt by their military divisions under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. At the Lord's command, Moses wrote down the starting points for the stages of their journey. These were the stages listed by their starting points. They traveled from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the month. On the day after the Passover, the Israelites went out defiantly in the sight of all the Egyptians. Meanwhile, the Egyptians were bearing every firstborn male the Lord had struck down among them, for the Lord had executed judgment against their gods. The Israelites traveled from Ramses and camped at Succoth. They traveled from Succoth and camped at Etham, which is on the edge of the wilderness. They traveled from Etham and turned back to Pi-hahiroth, which faces Baal-zephon, and they camped before Migdol. They traveled from Pi-hahiroth and crossed through the middle of the sea into the wilderness. They took a 3-day journey into the wilderness of Etham and camped at Marah. They traveled from Marah and came to Elim. There were 12 springs and 70 date palms at Elim, so they camped there. They traveled from Elim and camped by the Red Sea. They traveled from the Red Sea and camped in the wilderness of Sin. They traveled from the wilderness of Sin and camped in Dophkah. They traveled from Dophkah and camped at Elush. They traveled from Elush and camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. They traveled from Rephidim and camped in the wilderness of Sinai. They traveled from the wilderness of Sinai and camped at Kibroth Hattava. They traveled from Kibroth Hattava and camped at Hazeroth. They traveled from Hazeroth and camped at Rithmah. They traveled from Rithmah and camped at Rimmon Perez. They traveled from Rimmon Perez and camped at Libnah. They traveled from Libnah and camped at Rissa. They traveled from Rissa and camped at Kehelatha. They traveled from Kehelatha and camped at Mount Shepher. They traveled from Mount Shepher and camped at Heradah. They traveled from Heradah and camped at Machhiloth. They traveled from Machhiloth and camped at Tahath. They traveled from Tahath and camped at Terah. They traveled from Terah and camped at Mithkah. They traveled from Mithkah and camped at Hashmonah. They traveled from Hashmonah and camped at Moseroth. They traveled from Moseroth and camped at Bene-Jacan. They traveled from Bene-Jacan and camped at Hor Haggidgad. They traveled from Hor Haggidgad and camped at Jotbathah. They traveled from Jotbathah and camped at Abrana. They traveled from Abrana and camped at Ezion-Geber. They traveled from Ezion-Geber and camped in the wilderness of Zin, that is Kadesh. They traveled from Kadesh and camped at Mount Hor on the edge of the land of Edom. At the Lord's command, the priest Aaron climbed Mount Hor and died there on the first day of the 5th month in the 40th year after the Israelites went out of the land of Egypt. Aaron was 123 years old when he died on Mount Hor. At that time, the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev in the land of Canaan, heard the Israelites were coming. They traveled from Mount Hor and camped at Zalmanah. They traveled from Zalmanah and camped at Punan. They traveled from Punan and camped at Oboth. They traveled from Oboth and camped at Abarim on the border of Moab. They traveled from Lyam and camped at Dibon Gad. They traveled from Dibon Gad and camped at Almon Diblathaim. They traveled from Almon Diblathaim and camped in the Abarim range facing Nebo. They traveled from the Abarim range and camped on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. They camped by the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth to the Acacia meadow on the plains of Moab. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. Tell the Israelites, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you must drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all their stone images and cast images and demolish all their high places. You are to take possession of the land and settle in it because I have given you the land to possess. You are to receive the land as an inheritance, by lot, according to your clans. Increase the inheritance for a large clan and decrease it for a small one. Whatever place the lot indicates for someone will be his. You will receive an inheritance according to your ancestral tribes. But if you don't drive out the inhabitants of the land before you, those you allow to remain will become barbs for your eyes and thorns for your sides. They will harass you in the land where you will live. And what I had planned to do to them, I will do to you. I love you, Jonathan and Jesse.